The gavel fell, and the word guilty hung in the stagnant air of the courtroom like a death sentence. Guilty. I was sentenced to 5 years, not for a crime I committed, but for an act of disrespect I refused to swallow. They charged me with aggravated assault for throwing a glass of water in the face of the man who cornered me in the kitchen, the same man everyone in the restaurant protected. The instant the cold handcuffs locked onto my wrists, I lost not only my freedom, I lost my name. I became a number, a grim example of what happens when a woman demands to be treated with dignity. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I was the deputy chief in one of the city's most acclaimed restaurants. My life was about order and precision. I believed in justice because I practiced it, living by the rules and naively believing that if you were honest, the system would take care of you. But I was wrong. The system isn't designed to protect women who speak out. It's designed to silence us. The transition from the courthouse to the prison van was a blur of flashing lights, shouted orders, and the metallic smell of fear. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the sound. The sound of that massive steel gate closing behind me was the loneliest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't a loud bang. It was a final, heavy click, the sound of the world forgetting me forever. The smell of cheap disinfectant and ancient despair filled the air, and I realized that the real sentence wasn't 5 years. It was daily survival. They threw me into a holding cell. The cold light from the corridor cut through the darkness, illuminating the faces of the other women, faces marked by anger, hardened by loss, or empty with resignation. One of them looked at me, her eyes seeing nothing. "Welcome to nothingness," she whispered, her voice hoarse. That first night, lying on a thin mattress that smelled of dried tears and mold, I cried. I cried for the injustice, for the loss of my career, for the betrayal of the system I swore to respect. But I still didn't know that one of those silent women, there in that same cell, held the key to my destiny. I thought prison was about punishment. I thought it was about paying for what I did, even if what I did was in self-defense. But I was wrong. Prison wasn't the end of my story. It was the twisted beginning of a journey that would take me to the depths of human depravity and, paradoxically, to the unexpected power of redemption. I was imprisoned for demanding dignity, but what I found inside, in the deafening silence of my cell, was something much deeper. Faith. And that faith would change everything. Welcome to my story. What you are about to hear is not just an account, it is my voice emerging from the silence. I will take you with me inside those walls, beyond the concrete and steel, so that you can understand not only what happened to me, but how my soul survived. If you believe my story deserves to be heard, if you feel there is an injustice here that needs to be exposed, then I ask you to stay. This is more than a story about prison. It's about the desperate search for dignity and the discovery that true freedom is sometimes found in the darkest places. If what I've said so far has touched your heart, please show your support by clicking the button. Enjoy. This helps ensure that my voice and other stories of hope and redemption like mine can reach more people. I want to know where you're listening to me from. Pain and hope have no borders, and it gives me immense strength to know how far my story is traveling. Please leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from. Country and city, are you keeping me company tonight? Your interaction is what gives me the strength to keep sharing. And if you're new here and want to join me until the end of this journey, please consider, subscribe, and activate the bell. Now, prepare your heart. My story is only beginning, and what I discovered in the darkness will challenge everything you think you know about justice and miracles. The silence that followed that first night was deceptive. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a silence of waiting. A vacuum filled with held breaths, the creaking of metal bunks, and the muffled sob of a woman at the end of the corridor. I clung to my anger. Injustice was the only thing that belonged to me, the only thing they couldn't take from me. I replayed the trial in my mind, again and again. That man's complacent face, the water hitting his expensive shirt, my lawyer telling me to look remorseful. How could I remorse demanding to be treated like a human being? I was so angry. But the cold concrete floor seeped through the thin mattress, and for the first time I realized that anger wouldn't keep me warm. The cold iron of the cell seemed to have its own smell, a metallic smell of finality mixed with the acrid odor of cheap disinfectant and old sweat. At 4 a.m, hell awoke. White fluorescent lights crackled and flooded the cell with a brutal, merciless brightness. There was no gentle awakening. It was a visual assault. "Stand up! Count!" the voice yelled, distorted by a loudspeaker. The sound of keys, a sharp metallic clatter, became the alarm clock of my new life. We were led out of the holding cell for processing. It was there that the dehumanization truly began. "Take off your clothes, turn around, open your mouth, crouch." The guard's voice was monotonous, bored. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a procedure. They took my chef's uniform, my last vestige of identity, and handed me a faded orange uniform, rough and smelling of bleach, and hundreds of anonymous bodies. With the uniform came my new name. Unfit 478B. Sarah Jenkins was dead, or at least she'd been left outside that steel gate. I looked at the other women in line. Some looked my age, others looked like they'd lived 3 lives. They didn't cry. Their faces were masks of stone. They knew something I didn't yet know, that tears here were a luxury, or worse, an invitation to predation. "Keep your head down, rookie," a harsh voice murmured beside me, without even looking at me. "Looking is a weapon here, and you just handed yours over." I didn't understand then. I only knew that the ground beneath my feet was icy, and the woman I saw reflected in a dirty window wasn't me. It was an orange ghost. After 48 hours of processing, they moved me to the general population, the pop genre. The term sounded almost civilized, like something you'd read in a pamphlet. The reality was a sensory assault. The noise was constant, a roar of 100 trapped voices echoing off the concrete and steel. It was the sound of contained chaos. "Ward 3B, the guard shouted, pointing to a heavy metal door. "Jenkins, 478B, you're in 207. The door swung open with an electronic hum, and I stepped into what they called a pod. It was 2 levels of metal cells, built around a common area with steel tables bolted to the floor and a small television hanging high on a wall, protected by a metal cage. My cell, 207, was already occupied. She was sitting on the bottom bunk, braiding her hair with a precision that reminded me of myself in the kitchen. She didn't look up when I came in. It was her. The woman from the holding cell, the one who told me, "Welcome to nowhere." She was small, but there was a density about her, a stillness that seemed more dangerous than the screams outside. "You stay on top," she said, her voice low, barely audible above the noise. I threw my sheets onto the thin mattress on top. The space was claustrophobic. A metal sink and a stainless steel toilet were less than a meter from our beds. There was no privacy. There was no dignity. "My name is Sarah," I said stupidly. She finally stopped braiding and looked at me. Her eyes were dark and tired. "Nobody here has a name," she replied. "We have reputations. And now, you don't have one." My cellmate was called Maria. She'd been there for 3 years, for something drug-related, she said. But she didn't talk much. She taught me the unspoken rules, the invisible laws that kept that wing running. Don't sit on anyone's bunk without permission. Don't touch the TV remote. Don't cut in line on the phone. Ever. Wait your turn for the shower and be quick. And most importantly, don't talk to the guards about anything. "You don't see, you don't hear, you don't speak," she instructed, her voice an urgent whisper. "What do you think justice is out there? In here, it's survival." That night, the reality of time hit me. 5 years. 1,825 nights listening to the hum of that fluorescent light and the sound of Maria's breathing beneath me. The cell wasn't a room. It was a sounding board for fear. The most dangerous place in prison wasn't the dark cell or the shower. It was the cafeteria. It was the daily battleground for respect. The air was heavy with the smell of overcooked food and tension. Groups formed at specific tables, divided by invisible alliances, what they called the prison's families. Like a chef, the sight of the food was a personal insult. Gray mush, a piece of dry bread. But as a prisoner, it was fuel. And all that mattered was getting that fuel without drawing attention. I picked up my tray, keeping my eyes down, searching for an empty spot in the corner. And then, it happened. I felt the impact before I saw it. A huge woman, whom everyone called Rhino, blocked my path. She didn't move. She looked me up and down, a mocking smile on her face. The entire cafeteria fell silent. 100 pairs of eyes turned to me. It was a test. The air thinned. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding weak, pathetic. She laughed, a low, guttural sound. "Look," she said to her table. "The little princess of the kitchen can talk." She stepped forward, invading my space. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I could smell her sweat and something sweet, perhaps an improvised perfume. I remembered what Maria said. Don't show weakness. I remembered what the man did in the restaurant, cornering me. The same anger, the same heat, rose in my throat. "You gonna fight, rookie?" she growled, her face inches from mine. I could fight, I could scream, I could run, but I did the only thing I knew how to do. I straightened up, meeting her gaze. My tray trembled, but my voice didn't. "I don't want trouble," I said clearly and coldly. "I just want to eat." The silence stretched. Rhino examined me. She was looking for fear, and though I was terrified, she saw something else. She saw the deputy chief. She saw the woman who commanded a 20-person kitchen under pressure. She saw the same dignity for which I was imprisoned. She snorted, a sound of disdain, but took a step aside. "Lose yourself," she spat. The cafeteria hummed again. I walked to the furthest table, my legs like jelly. I didn't win. I merely survived. But I had made a grave mistake. I showed her that I wasn't broken. And in their world, a woman who doesn't bend is a woman who needs to be broken. The days began to merge. Time in prison doesn't pass. It accumulates, like dust in a locked room. Routine was our cage, and paradoxically, our only sanity. The shrill sound they used instead of a bell to wake us up at 4:30 in the morning still echoes in my ears. It wasn't a sound to wake us up, it was a sound to frighten us. The countdown. Standing, uniform straight, hands visible. The morning countdown. The afternoon countdown. The night countdown. 3 times a day, we were reminded that we were cattle. The smell of weak coffee and watered-down oatmeal was the smell of the morning. The smell of bleach and industrial soap was the smell of the afternoon. And the smell of stagnant fear and sweat, that was the smell of the night. I was assigned to the laundry. The heat was stifling, a thick steam clinging to your skin and lungs. The noise of the industrial machines was deafening, a constant metallic roar that forced us to shout to be heard, but most of us simply stopped talking. We spent 8 hours folding rough sheets, uniforms that smelled of unknown lives. It was hard, exhausting work, but I grabbed it. The work was the only thing that made sense. In the kitchen, I created. In the laundry, I folded. It was the same precision, the same order, applied to a different kind of chaos. The other women sang softly or argued in whispers. I would concentrate on the crease. A perfect crease was a small victory. It was the only thing that day I could control. And it was in this routine that hope began to die. In the first few weeks, I was still the chef, the wronged woman. I was counting down the days until my appeal. My public defender, a young man in a cheap suit with tired eyes, visited me. He spoke of procedures and low odds. He didn't use the word guilt, but it was there, in his tone. Reality hit me there, in that smelly visiting room, separated by thick glass and speaking on a phone that smelled of disinfectant. The system wasn't going to save me. The truth didn't matter. The injustice that put me there was final. That night, for the first time, I didn't cry from anger. I cried from emptiness. The woman who entered that prison, the Sarah Jenkins who demanded dignity, was disappearing. The nothing Maria spoke of. I was beginning to understand it. Surviving my first encounter with Rhino in the cafeteria wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of a cold war. She didn't confront me physically again, not immediately. Power in prison is rarely that direct. It's a matter of whispers, of glances, of small cruelties designed to break your spirit, not your bones. She watched me. I could feel her eyes on me in the laundry room, in the yard, in the phone line. It was a heavy, assessing gaze. She was waiting for me to stumble. She made the other women in her family bump into me. My food would accidentally fall off the tray. My clean sheets would disappear from the laundry, forcing me to redo the work while the guard yelled at me for being slow. They were tests, little pricks to see if I would bleed. The hardest part was the isolation. Nobody spoke to me. Speaking to me meant putting yourself on Rhino's radar, and nobody wanted that. Not even Maria. My cellmate still gave me short, practical advice. Eat fast. Don't leave your soap out in the open. But there was a distance. She couldn't afford to be my friend. I was alone, an island in a sea of silent hostility. I spent my free hours on the top bunk, reading old books from the prison library, pretending that the words on the page were louder than the whispered insults I heard as I passed by. Kitchen princess. Thinks she's better than us. The tension finally broke on a rainy afternoon. We didn't have a patio because of the weather, and the pod was filled with an electric, restless energy. I was reading. Rhino and his group were playing cards on the metal table below, the sound of the cards clinking like small gunshots. "Hey, 478B, she called. The entire ward fell silent. I slowly lowered my book. "What is it?" She smiled, that same mocking smile. "I heard you cooked for rich people. You must know how to serve. My shoulder hurts. Come massage it." The request was absurd. It was about power. It was about public humiliation. The silence was absolute. All eyes were on me. If I refused, it would be a fight. If I accepted, I would be broken. I would be hers. The air was so thick I could barely breathe. I looked at Rhino. I could see the anticipation in her eyes. I didn't want to say no. She was hungry for violence. I opened my mouth, my heart pounding against my ribs like a caged bird. And that's when I heard it. "Leave her alone, Brenda." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a sharp knife. It was Maria, my cellmate. She hadn't even gotten up from her bunk. She was lying on her side, reading her own worn Bible, as if commenting on the weather. The woman who told me not to have a name, who told me that nobody had friends, had just spoken. Rhino, Brenda, turned slowly. Her face was dark with anger. No one spoke to her like that. "What did you say, you addict?" Maria sighed, a tired sound, and sat down. She carefully marked her page in the Bible before looking at Rhino. Maria was small, maybe half the size of Brenda, but there was no fear in her. There was only a deep weariness. "I said," she repeated calmly, "leave her alone. Aren't you bored with this same stupid game? You won. Everyone knows you're in charge. Now sit down and finish your game." The challenge was so unexpected, so quiet, that Rhino didn't know how to react. She was prepared for a fist, not for logic. She looked at Maria, then at me, then back at Maria. The tension was unbearable. For a moment, I thought Rhino would attack Maria. But something in Maria's quietness disarmed her. Rhino snorted, a sound of frustration. "Whatever," she spat, turning back to her card game. "She's not even worth the effort." The moment passed. The hum of the ward resumed, but something had changed. I looked at Maria. She was already back with her Bible, as if nothing had happened. She didn't save me out of friendship. She saved me out of principle? Or maybe, as she said, she was just bored. That night, the silence in our cell felt different. "Why did you do that?" I whispered into the darkness. I heard the sound of her turning over in the bottom bunk. "I don't like noise," she whispered back. "And she makes a lot of noise. Now sleep." But it wasn't just that. For the first time in months, I wasn't completely alone. And for the first time, I looked at the woman in the bottom bunk and saw something more than a prisoner. I saw the woman they mentioned on my first day, the key to my destiny. Perfect. Let's continue Sarah's journey, delving deeper into her relationship with Maria and the inevitable crisis that will lead her in a new direction. After that night, the silence in our cell changed. It was no longer an empty silence. It was a shared silence. Maria didn't become my friend, not in the way the outside world understands. Friendship in prison is a transaction. It's about protection and debts. But what we had was something different. It was respect. She went back to reading her Bible, and I went back to reading my paperback novels, but now, when she turned a page, I was aware of it. I began to truly notice her. I noticed how she folded her uniform with the same precision I used in the laundry. I noticed she never ate dessert, saving it to exchange for extra soap or stationery. And I noticed how she read. Every night, after the lights went out, when the only illumination came from the crack in the hallway door, Maria would lean out of her bunk bed. She held her worn Bible in that dim light and read in a whisper so low it was almost inaudible. I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, the gentle cadence of her voice. It was a ritual. I, who grew up going to church only on holidays, found it strange, almost desperate. One night, curiosity got the better of me. "What are you reading there?" I whispered in the darkness. She didn't stop. "The truth," she whispered back. I scoffed softly. "The truth? The truth is that we're trapped here." She finally stopped and looked up, her dark silhouette against the dim light. "The truth, Sarah, is that I was an addict who sold everything I had for a fix. I abandoned my son. I deserved to be here." I was silent. It was the first personal thing she'd said to me in months. "But this book," she continued, her voice still a whisper, but now with a weight that struck my chest, "tells me that I am not my worst mistake. It says I can be forgiven." I didn't know what to say. Forgiveness seemed like an alien concept, a weakness. I didn't want forgiveness. I wanted justice. "I don't need forgiveness," I said, harder than I intended. "I didn't do anything wrong." Maria was quiet for a long time. "That's your problem, Chef. You think your prison is worse than mine because you believe yourself innocent," she finally said, turning to her Bible. "But pride is a much smaller cell than this one, and it has no door." Maria's words angered me. Pride? I called it dignity. I wasn't ready to give up my anger. It was all that remained of my old life. If I wasn't angry, then I was just another one of them, another criminal. I decided Maria was wrong. Justice still existed. I just needed to reach the right people. I used my cafeteria privilege to buy stationery and stamped envelopes. And I started writing. I wrote to my former CEO, explaining the situation, reminding him of my professionalism, my worth. I described the injustice, the harassment, the retaliation. I begged him to speak to the restaurant's lawyer, to tell the truth to my appeals attorney. I also wrote to a former classmate from culinary school, someone I considered a friend. I asked her to be a character witness. I poured my soul onto those pages, my handwriting cramped, full of urgency. I clung to those letters as if they were lifeboats. I delivered them to the prison post office, a slow and censored system. And then I waited. Waiting in prison is a different kind of torture. Every day, during the mail roll call, my heart raced. The officer shouted names, and each name that wasn't mine was a small cut. I watched the other women receiving letters from their children, photos of grandchildren, and I received nothing. I saw their joy and tasted the bitter taste of envy and loneliness. A week passed. 2. 3. My friend's letter never arrived, the letter to my boss. That one came back. It came back with a red, aggressive stamp on the front. Returned to sender. Refused. Refused. He didn't even open it. He didn't want to get involved. My loyalty, my years of work, my talent, it meant nothing. I held that returned envelope in my hand. It was the final proof. The door to my old life wasn't just closed, it was locked, and they'd thrown away the key. The world had forgotten me. The Sarah Jenkins I knew was officially dead. That night, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the nothingness that Maria described on the first night. It was an absolute coldness, an emptiness in the center of my chest. I had hit rock bottom. Rhino still tormented me, but I barely noticed. The guards yelled, but I barely heard. I went to the laundry room, folded the sheets, ate the gray porridge, and returned to my bunk. I was a shell, an orange ghost, exactly as I felt on my first day. I had lost my career, my reputation, my appeal, and now my last connection to the world. The pride Maria mentioned was no longer there. The dignity I had fought for seemed like a cruel joke. I was nothing. Unfit 478B. A statistic, a broken woman in a top bunk in a world that didn't care if I lived or died. It was late at night. The prison was quiet, except for the occasional snoring and hum of electricity. I couldn't sleep. I stared at the metal ceiling, feeling the emptiness consume me. And then I heard it. It wasn't the whisper of Maria reading. It was a different sound. A soft sound of fabric on concrete. I looked down. In that faint streak of light from the hallway, I saw Maria. She wasn't in bed. She was kneeling beside the bunk. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped. She wasn't reading, she was praying. And she was crying. Not the loud, desperate crying I sometimes heard, but a silent, heartbreaking cry. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered words I couldn't understand. I watched for a long time. I saw her pain. It was as raw, as real as my own. She, the woman who taught me to be tough, the woman who stood up to Rhino, was on her knees. She wasn't praying for justice. She was praying for mercy. And suddenly, something inside me broke. The dam of pride, anger, and injustice I had built crumbled. Tears began to stream down my face, hot and silent. I didn't know who I was crying for. For myself? For her? For all of us? I slid out of my bunk, the cold metal on my bare feet. And in the darkness of that cell, beside the woman I barely knew, I knelt too. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't been to church. I didn't know the words. So I just whispered to nothing, to the ceiling, to the universe. God, I said, my voice breaking. If you're there, if you can hear me, I can't take it anymore. Please, help me. I don't know how long we stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Time stopped mattering. When I finally stood up, my legs were numb, but the emptiness in my chest felt different. It wasn't cold anymore. It was just quiet. Maria was already back in her bunk, her back to me. Neither of us spoke about it. There were no words for what had happened. The next morning, on the count, everything seemed the same. The fluorescent light was still harsh. The guard's voice was still a bark. But I wasn't the same. Kneeling hadn't changed the prison, but it had changed the prisoner. The pride that defined me, the anger that was my shield, had dissolved, and in their place, there was only space. That night, after the lights went out, I lay down on my bunk and waited. I waited for the familiar sound of Maria whispering from her Bible, but the sound didn't come. Instead, I heard her voice, clear in the darkness, not a whisper, but normal speech. Can you read to me? I turned. What? My eyes, she said, her voice frustrated. They get blurry in this dim light. I lose my words. Can you read to me? I hesitated. I hadn't touched a Bible since I was a child. I don't know where to begin, I stammered. John, she said simply. Chapter 8. I climbed down from the bunk bed. I sat on the edge of her bed, picking up the heavy book. The pages were thin as tissue paper, worn by the touch of her thumbs. There were notes in the margins, underlined words, and stains that looked like dried tears. I leaned toward the dim light of the hallway and found the place, and I read. My voice sounded strange to myself, reading words about scribes and Pharisees. And then I came to the verse. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. I stopped. My throat tightened. I read it again, in a low voice. He who is without sin among you. I had spent months throwing stones. At the man who harassed me, at the judge, at my boss, at Rhino, at myself. And there was Maria, who admitted her own mistakes, asking me to read the one sentence that completely disarmed me. My life became a new ritual. Every night, I read to Maria. And the more I read, the more I understood. I read about forgiveness, and I began to understand what she was searching for. I read about grace, and I began to wonder if it applied to me. And Maria, in turn, began to talk. She told me about her son, Miguel, who was in the foster care system. She told me about how addiction was like a prison long before this one, a chemical cell from which she couldn't escape. She wasn't justifying herself, she was confessing. And listening to her pain, my own pain, the injustice, the anger, began to seem smaller. Not less important, but less lonely. She was no longer just the addict, she was Maria. And I was no longer the innocent chef, I was just Sarah. Things also started to change in prison. My job was transferred from the hot, noisy laundry room to the kitchen. I don't know how, maybe Maria spoke to someone. Maybe it was just random. But suddenly, I was back. The smell wasn't ovkok ovan or artisanal bread. It was made from potato powder and processed meat. But it was a kitchen. The other women who worked there were rough and quick, moving with factory efficiency. A chef, from inside the prison, a civilian woman named Mrs. Davis, looked at me suspiciously. "I heard you were classy," she said, throwing me a peeler. "Here you're quick or you're out." I accepted the challenge. I was more than fast. I was a professional. My hands remembered the rhythm, peeling, chopping, stirring. Within 2 weeks, I was commanding the vegetable line, and I started doing small things. I took the onion peels and carrot skins they threw away and started making a basic broth. I added it to the gray sauce. I showed them how to organize their stations so they wouldn't bump into each other. I wasn't giving orders. I was teaching. And they responded. For the first time, I was using my skills not for my ego, but to serve. One night, at dinner time, one of the women on my kitchen line gave me a nod. "Hey, chef, that slop today. It almost tasted like food," she said. It was the greatest compliment I've ever received. Working in the kitchen gave me purpose. Reading nightly with Maria gave me peace. Prison was still a horrible place. Rhino was still there, a silent threat, but she seemed to have lost interest in me. I was no longer an interesting target. I no longer reacted with the pride she liked to poke at. I had something more. I had my reading, I had my work. But something was still missing. I understood Maria's forgiveness for herself. I didn't understand what that had to do with anything. With me, I was still the victim, the wronged woman imprisoned for a crime she didn't commit. My cell was made of bricks. Hers was made of guilt. I could still see that difference. One night, I was reading the book of Matthew to Mary. She had fallen asleep, her breathing soft and regular in the bunk below. I continued reading silently to myself in the dim light. I was reading the Lord's Prayer, words I had recited by heart in childhood without ever thinking. And then I came to the line, "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors." I stopped. Just as we forgive, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a condition. It was a mirror. I closed the Bible, my heart pounding. All those months, I had been praying, first for justice, then for help, then for peace. But I had never forgiven. I hadn't forgiven the man who harassed me. I hadn't forgiven the system that failed me. I hadn't forgiven my boss who abandoned me. And I certainly hadn't forgiven Rhino. I was trapped in my own righteousness, clinging to my anger as if it were a badge of honor. And I realized, in that dark cell, that Maria had been right from the start. Pride was a cell. My innocence was my prison. And if I didn't forgive those who put me there, I would never, ever be free. This achievement hit me like a physical force. Just as we forgive, I hadn't forgiven. I was imprisoned, not by the 5 years of my sentence, but by my refusal to let go of the past. I was chained to my own justice. The next morning, I moved through the prison, but everything seemed different. The air felt thinner. The gray of the walls seemed deeper. I went to the kitchen, my hands moving automatically, chopping carrots, stirring the pot of porridge. But my mind was elsewhere. It was on that verse. I had to try. I had to see if it was real. I needed to forgive. And the face that came to my mind wasn't the judge's, nor my boss's. It was Brenda's. Rhino. She came down the breakfast line as usual, her face a mask of disdain, pushing her tray along the metal bar. She didn't even look at me. I was just the slop lady. I served her portion of oatmeal, and then I made something that wasn't on the menu. There was a small supply of cornbread we kept for the guards, baked the night before, still slightly warm. I took the biggest, softest piece, the corner piece, and placed it on her tray. She stopped. She looked at the bread and then at me. Her face contorted in confusion, then suspicion. "What is this?" she growled, her voice low. "Are you trying to poison me?" Chef the cafeteria, as always, seemed to notice the break in the routine. I took a deep breath, my ears ringing. I looked directly into her eyes. Not with pride, not with defiance, but just looked. "No," I said, my voice calm. "You looked like you needed something extra this morning. That's all." I didn't smile. It wasn't a gesture of friendship. It was a gesture of release. She stared at me for another 10 seconds, an eternity in that tense silence. She was looking for the trick, the trap. But there wasn't one. There was just a piece of bread. She picked up the tray without saying a word and walked away. I went back to serving the next person, my hands trembling slightly. I hadn't moved a mountain. I hadn't received a miracle. But I had done it. I had forgiven my debtor. And I felt a small click inside me, like an old lock finally yielding to the key. The rest of my time passed differently. The days were still long. The work was still hard, but the cell didn't seem so small anymore. Rhino never spoke to me again. She didn't thank me, nor did she torment me. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me from across the cafeteria with an expression I couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger. It was just stillness. The power she held over me had evaporated because the anger she stirred up was no longer there. I continued my work in the kitchen, continued my nightly readings with Maria. Our cell became a sanctuary. We read, we talked about her son, Miguel, and about my lost dreams of owning a restaurant. We talked about our failings. She was my witness, and I was hers. One day, my public defender called me, the same young man in the cheap suit. But this time, his eyes weren't tired. "Sarah," he said, looking almost shocked. "Your parole hearing has been moved up. The warden, she wrote a letter on your behalf. The work in the kitchen, your change in behavior. You've served 3.5 years. They're going to release you." I didn't know what to say. Freedom. The word sounded strange, foreign. I thought I would feel an explosion of joy, a triumph. But all I felt was a strange tightness. I went back to my cell to tell Maria. She listened silently and then gave me a tight hug, the first she had ever given me. "God is good," she whispered. And then she turned away, and I saw the tears in her eyes. "Now go," she said. "Go and don't come back." On my last night, I read to her one last time. And when I turned off the light, I cried in the darkness. Not from sadness, but from a terrifying gratitude. And from guilt. Because I was leaving. And she wasn't. The day of my release was surreal. They gave me back my civilian clothes, the same ones I wore in court. They felt like costumes, the fabric too soft, strange against my skin. They led me through the same corridors I'd walked on the first day. The noise was the same, the smell was the same. But I wasn't. I passed through Wing 3B. I couldn't look at Cell 207. The guard led me to the last steel gate. The same gate that made that final heavy click 3.5 years earlier. But this time, the sound wasn't a click. It was a loud electronic hum, and the gate slid open with a groan. The sunlight hit me with full force. It was so bright, so overwhelming that I had to close my eyes. I stepped outside into the fresh air. I expected a prison bus to pick me up, but there was nothing. There was only a parking lot, the sound of cars passing on a distant highway, the smell of cut grass and diesel exhaust. The world. I was free. But I had never felt so lost. I had no home to return to. I had no job. The Sarah Jenkins they imprisoned was dead. The Sarah they released was a stranger. I stood there on the sidewalk with nowhere to go, only $20 in my pocket and a worn Bible that Maria insisted I take. I opened it. On the first page, in her trembling handwriting, she had written, "Your prison was never the bars. Go and forgive as you have been forgiven." And it was there, standing outside the prison, that I finally understood. The justice I wanted didn't matter. What I found was grace, and grace was far more powerful. Sometimes God doesn't open the cell. Sometimes He enters the cell with you and changes who you are inside. My story didn't end when that gate opened. In many ways, it only began. I found work in a shelter kitchen, serving people who, like me, were trying to find their way back. I adopted a dog, and I write to Maria every week. I became the voice from the outside that she didn't have. This story isn't just mine. If you've ever felt trapped, not by bars, but by your past, by injustice, by your own anger or pride, then this story is yours too. Thank you for listening, for being my witness tonight. If what I shared touched you, please click the button. Enjoy. This helps spread the message that no one is beyond redemption. I want to know how far my voice has traveled. Maria's journey and I seemed so lonely, and knowing that we are not alone gives me immense strength. Please leave a comment below telling me which one, country and city. Are you listening to me tonight? Your interaction is a light in the darkness. And if you'd like to hear more stories of faith found in the most unexpected places, please sign up and activate the bell. Share this with someone who needs to remember that even the deepest silence can one day transform into grace.